Hello Internet. Today we're going to be replacing both front wheel bearings on a 2004 two-wheel drive Ford F-150. It's got the 4.6 liter V8 in it. And I decided to shoot a video because wheel bearings aren't really all that exciting or new. You guys have seen me do them on the Dodge, you saw me do them on the Ford Taurus. These are different. I took the bad one off the other day just to look at it and make sure I knew what I was getting into. And it is different. On your two-wheel drive Ford pickup, your brake rotor and your bearings and hub assembly all come as one unit. So if you want to just replace the bearings without replacing the rotor, then you have to take out that snap ring back here, press out the old bearings and press in a set of new bearings. If you go to Advance and you look for a front wheel bearing for this truck, all you'll find are just the bearings. We even looked for a hub and bearing assembly. It wasn't listed under there. I even called AutoZone and had them check. They didn't have it. They didn't have it because it's listed under brake rotor. So we're going to replace both front ones. One of them we know is bad. There's going to be some fresh grease on it because when I took it off to figure out how it worked, I put some grease on it just to tide it over. The other one is probably fine, but it's probably not far behind the other one that we know is bad. So we're just going to do both of them. That way we have new rotors and new bearings on both front wheels. Alright, so here's how all this is done. You've got your brake caliper, the big bracket that it attaches to. You've got in here, there's a 35mm axle nut that actually compresses the bearing and holds all of this on. Then you've got a lock sort of cap here that slides over the points of the axle nut. And then there's a cotter pin here that slides down through a hole. I've got replacement pins because I broke this one the other day when I was taking it apart to figure out how it all went together. So the next step is I'm going to remove the brake caliper, and I'm going to do it in two pieces because I don't remember how difficult it is to get to the piston if I leave the bracket attached. And since we're going to be putting on a newer, thicker rotor, I'm going to need to compress that piston a little bit with a C-clamp, so I'm going to go ahead and take the caliper and the bracket off in two separate pieces. So the bolts to take off the caliper are a 13mm. These are still loose where I had them off the other day. Now the bolts that actually remove the bracket here with the pads is these right here. There's one up top and there's one down on the bottom. They're 18mm. I'm going to use a breaker bar to get them started, and then I'll use the ratchet to walk them off. Those aren't terribly tight because I had them off the other day. Alright, next step is to take out this cotter pin, straighten out this end of it. Alright, the way I know it's this bearing is twofold. Number one, when you go around a left-handed curve and the vehicle leans to the right, aka putting more weight on this wheel, you can hear it, kind of a growling, roaring noise. And when you straighten out or you go around left curves so that it's leaning away from this wheel, putting more weight over there, the sound goes away. But another way I knew is when I took off this tire and I took off the brake caliper so there's nothing else touching it, Yeah. It should be not, it should not be making that noise. So that's how we know that this is the bad wheel bearing. So now we've got the cotter pin out. Let's remove the little lock here. You got your 35mm socket, deep well with a breaker bar. All right. Let's see if I can get it back loose. Gosh. There we go. Now the only reason that one was that easy was because I had it off already the other day. But when I took it off the other day, I had to use a big long pipe. There she goes. They tighten up, they get a little bit of corrosion in there. You will probably need either air tools or a large cheater pipe. And I wouldn't recommend any smaller than a 1/2 inch breaker bar, because I have twisted the ends off of 3/8 breaker bars trying to do stuff like this. So now that it's moving, we take our breaker bar off. Alright, put our ratchet on, and we can just... And Mom said the grease I put on it quietened it down. It might have, but that's not going to repair a worn out bearing. It might make it a little quieter for a little bit, but if the bearing's bad, the bearing is bad. So, once you got the nut off, you might have to whack it a time or two, but it should basically just slide right off. New part. But before we put it on, we're going to go ahead, even though it's fairly fresh grease, I want to be a little OCD about it. Brake clean all this old grease, because I didn't brake clean the old stuff off when I put this on. And make sure that the spindle looks okay, that it's not cracked or scored or got any serious damage to it. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put a light coat of grease on the spindle. You don't have to go ham because it's such a tight fit. Most of it's going to get pushed off when you push the bearing on there. We just want a light coat between the two metal surfaces. And before we actually install this, the rotors come with a sort of anti-rust greasy substance on them. We want to brake clean the surface of the rotor, the braking surface, really well, so that you're not trying to stop with greasy rotors. So now that we brake clean the rotor, I'm going to do my best to just handle it by the edges. If you get a little bit of dirt on it, it's fine. It'll burn off. But line it up. And then once you get it started, slide it all the way back. Bam. We've got a new axle nut. One other thing I forgot to mention is if you look back here on the back of this, you can see those little... See that gear looking thing? That's a toning wheel for your ABS. And you see this little guy right there? Pokes in from the back side here. That is your ABS sensor. That basically tells the ABS system if that wheel is spinning or not. And when you slide this on, you want to make sure that it's almost but not quite touching, and that you don't accidentally bump it and knock it back out of its hole when you're installing the new bearing. What you don't want to do is use air tools. I think the torque for these is usually about 150 to 200 foot-pounds depending on the vehicle. And so if you use, decent air tools, I have put one on, the only one I ever put on with air tools. It felt fine for a while, but then that bearing went out in about 6 months because I actually squashed the race a little bit and egg-shaped it, and so it caused the bearing excess wear, and it went out faster, where it should last, at this point, the rest of the life of this vehicle. So when you're putting this axle nut on, you don't want to use air tools. You only want to use hand tools and a torque wrench if you want to make sure that you've got the torque exactly where it's supposed to be. Getting tight. You can kind of tell where it's supposed to stop. It'll get a little tight, and then all of a sudden it's just going to bottom out like it just stops, and that's when you know it's completely compressed those bearings out. And then I usually just use my body weight and just double check, and it's good to go. The only time I've ever had one go out was the one time I used an air tool to put it on. And I'm not using my big cheater pipe either, just the breaker bar and my body weight. Tight enough. So now you have to reinstall the lock. You see it's got points all the way around. You want to install it in such a way that the points catch on the corners of the axle nut, and the hole for the cotter pin lines up with one of the gaps. If the hole isn't lined up with a gap, you can just pull it off and rotate it until you hit a part where it is both locked on the nut and the hole is lined up with a gap. And then we drop in our new cotter pin. Alright, so you guys are on the under the vehicle side. We just reinstall our bracket here. There's one started. There's another one started. 1/2-inch ratchet, 18mm. That one. Now while we've got the caliper off, before we reinstall the actual caliper, one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to grease the slide pins here. There's one here and one here, and these are, oh, that one needs it. And these are what your caliper actually bolt to, but what they're supposed to do is they slide in and out so that as your caliper compresses and then releases when you press the brake pedal, the caliper can slide back and forth. One thing that happens as these age is these pins get a lot of brake dust, dirt, and corrosion in them. Like this one doesn't want to move, and what will happen is the caliper will stick. And so you may hit the brakes, but then because this pin doesn't freely let it move back and forth, it may stick in a compressed position somewhat. And so it'll make your brakes get hot, it might cause your rotor to warp, it'll cause all kinds of problems. So I like to, anytime I take them off, if I haven't done it recently, take these pins out and grease them. Now this one still has some grease on it. This one feels like it needs some. Alright, we got a little light coat of grease on that, okay? It's a lot better than it was. What about this one? Oh yeah. Okay, so prior to reinstalling the caliper, we need to make sure that these are turned more or less that way, because that flat side on the top and bottom of these line up with flats on the caliper itself, and that's what keeps these from rotating and loosening up and such while they're in operation. Compress this piston down to about the same as the other one. There we go. There we go. Got him. And we take our ratchet with our 13mm. I torque my bolts to 1.5 ugga-uggas. Everything looks okay to me. It spins, and besides the brake pads rubbing a little bit, there's no noise now. And everything looks okay to me. Brake pads and calipers installed. Sliding back and forth freely on the pins. We reinstall the tire. Get our flashlight and my tarp strap out of here before I forget them. Now I normally wouldn't tell you how to put these on, but if you look, there's 3 additional holes. One of them's larger. You line up the larger one with this tab while also slipping these guys over your lug nuts. Got him. So now it's one changed. Now I just got to do the other side, but I'm not recording it. It took me forever to do this and try to record it. But that is how you replace the wheel bearing on a 2004 two-wheel drive Ford F-150. Now the four-wheel drive one has a more conventional looking hub and bearing assembly like what I put on the Taurus, because it splines with the CV axle, since the front wheels also get power sometimes. But the two-wheel drive one is different than that and what's in my Dodge. It's a brake rotor and a hub and bearing assembly all in one unit. If you want to just replace the bearings, then you have to get the bearing kit and knock out the old bearings and press in the new ones. But I just wanted to make a quick video about this because first time I'd ever seen a two-wheel drive Ford front wheel bearing, and thought I would share. If y'all like the video, consider a thumbs up and a subscription. Y'all take care, have a good one. Marcus out.